This presentation is called Silence on the Podium: Why Elite Sport Must Confront Its Mental Health Crisis. I'm going to argue that elite sports institutions are not just failing to treat mental illness in athletes, they're actively creating the conditions that cause it. And I'll show you why this isn't just a national problem, it's happening right here at UAB. In the summer of 2021, Simone Biles, the greatest gymnast who has ever lived, withdrew from the Olympic finals and said she needed to focus on her mental health. A few weeks earlier, Naomi Osaka stepped away from the French Open and described years of depression behind the wins. The sports world was stunned, but these weren't weak athletes having bad days. These were the best in the world breaking down under conditions nobody had bothered to question. We have a cultural assumption that elite athletes are built differently, mentally tougher and more resilient. But Simon Rice's 2016 systematic review found that high performance and psychological suffering are not mutually exclusive. In fact, the pressure required to reach elite levels often makes mental health outcomes worse, not better. Biles, Osaka, Michael Phelps, Kevin Love, they aren't exceptions. They're the visible tip of something much larger. Part of why this has gone unaddressed for so long is structural. Sports medicine built itself entirely around the body. The Bassis Bakchi's research on athletic nutrition illustrates how thoroughly the field focused on physical optimization and how thoroughly mental health was left out. That absence was not neutral. When an entire professional field treats something as invisible, it sends a message to coaches, teams, and also the athletes that this does not matter. That omission helped build a culture of silence that we're still living in today. Here's what the data actually shows. Elite athletes experience depression at nearly 1.5 times the rate of the general population. Anxiety is 50% higher, but burnout is the most striking gap. Athletes experience it at 3.5 times the rate of average people. These aren't flukes. And importantly, competitive success offers zero protection. Reaching the top of your sport does not make you immune. So, where does this come from? Gustafson's 2011 systematic review on burnout showed that chronic overtraining and relentless performance pressure consistently produce emotional exhaustion and psychological withdrawal, even in athletes who look totally fine from the outside. The key insight here is that these aren't accidents. The same conditions that produce elite performance are often the ones quietly eroding well being underneath. You can't address mental health in sport while keeping the environment that creates the damage completely untouched. Even when help exists, athletes don't use it. Smith and Lieberman's research gets at why. The stories athletes absorb about toughness and weakness determine whether resources ever get accessed. Some coaches frame therapy as softness. Team cultures make silence the only safe option. Media treats mental health unevenly, sometimes with empathy, sometimes as a punchline. An athlete sitting inside all of that is not going to walk through a door just because the door is there. And here's the central paradox of everything I've been describing. Despite having higher rates of depression, anxiety, and burnout than the general population, elite athletes are less likely to seek mental health support. 50% of athletes report seeking help, compared to 70% of the general population. That 20-point gap is not a coincidence. It's the direct measurable result of a culture that has told athletes over and over again that psychological vulnerability is incompatible with athletic excellence. The International Olympic Committee tried to address this in 2019. Reardon published a formal consensus statement establishing guidelines for mental health in elite athletes. It was meaningful. It carried real institutional weight. But a document doesn't follow athletes into locker rooms or training sessions. It doesn't change what a coach says when a player admits they're struggling. The distance between a published policy and actual cultural change is where most athletes still live. Glick argues that the most effective structural change is embedding mental health professionals directly into team medical staffs year round, not just when something goes wrong. When athletes grow up in performance cultures, they won't voluntarily seek out help that feels external or optional. Making mental health care a visible, normal part of how a team operates changes what it feels like to access it. But hiring one sports psychologist while keeping every other structure the same is not integration. It's just optics. This isn't abstract. UAB fields 17 Division I sports programs right here in Birmingham. Behind every Blazers uniform is a student athlete managing academic pressure, athletic demands, and everything else that comes with being a college student, all at once. 35% of NCAA student athletes report feeling overwhelmed during the season. 1 in 3 elite athletes will experience a clinically significant mental health disorder during their career. These are UAB students. This research describes people on this campus. The deepest barrier isn't structural, it's cultural. Even when resources exist, what athletes believe about needing help shapes whether they ever use them. Sports institutions can't just build the infrastructure and assume demand will follow. They have to actively challenge the narratives their environments produce. So here's my argument, stated plainly. Elite sports institutions need to stop treating mental health care as a box to check and start taking real responsibility for the environments that are making athletes sick in the first place. That means embedded care, cultural accountability, and genuine institutional commitment, not just another policy document. What would that actually look like? Four things. First, the NCAA and Conference USA need to mandate and enforce minimum staffing standards for mental health professionals across all Division I programs, not just recommend them. Second, psychological awareness training needs to be required for all head coaches. Third, institutions need to actively amplify elite voices on mental health, not just tolerate it when athletes choose to speak. And fourth, which is the hardest one, the training environments that produce burnout and anxiety need to be reformed, not just supplemented. The silence on the podium has gone on long enough. Elite sport has the resources, the research, and now the public pressure to act. What it needs is institutions willing to take genuine responsibility, not just draft another document, for the psychological well being of the people who make sports worth watching in the first place. The infrastructure is not the problem, the culture is.